Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the future of logistics. This webinar is sponsored by G3 Enterprises, and we have one of their great experts with us here today to talk about the future of logistics and the impacts on the wine industry. Now, before we move into the actual presentation, just a few notes. This webinar is pre-recorded, but the speakers are available here in the live chat during the whole webinar. So if you have any questions throughout, just put them into the live chat here and they'll answer them as we go along. Now, without further ado, let me kick this over to John to introduce Nicole. John?
Thank you, Kim. This is John Segali on behalf of the Wine Industry Network, and welcome to the seminar on the future of logistics. With constant changes and continued supply chain disruption in today's global economy, what are the impacts to logistics in 2023? And what does this mean for the wine industry? We're fortunate to be joined today by Nicole Ostertag, Director of Business Development for G3 Enterprises. Nicole is an expert in logistics. A large focus of Nicole's role is the continued expansion of G3's warehousing and transportation service offerings. Prior to joining G3, Nicole spent several years working at a railroad with expertise in food and beverage as well. She is a rock climber, which also must come in handy when dealing with the challenges of logistics today. Nicole, welcome. Let's jump right into it. What's the condition of the supply chain today?
Thanks, John. We've got a lot of information on the supply chain market today. If you jump to the agenda slide here, you'll see that I'm going to cover things like the economy and how that's going to impact freight rates and what those are going to do in 2023, regulatory updates and port strikes, things like that. And then we'll jump into rail and how rail may be right for your business, how rail has evolved to potentially supply the wine industry better as well. So the big question on everybody's mind is what will happen with the economy this year? I recently had an opportunity to sit in a presentation from Bob Costello, who's a lead economist with the American Trucking Association, and really considered an industry expert at predicting where the freight economy will land. Like many economists, Bob is predicting that there will be a mild recession this year, but that the timing remains a bit uncertain. Many businesses are really reeling from the knee-jerk reactions that they took in 2020 related to the pandemic business dips that were met with drastic workforce reductions, only to have that business rebound quicker than they could replenish their labor. As a result, many businesses are hoarding their labor after those types of reactions that they had in 2020. Even though we haven't seen economic recession really quite yet, we are expecting that in late 2023, and the freight recession has already dipped to that recessive point. In regard to the freight economy, demand for products has dropped while demand for services has increased. Pandemic spending led to many consumers depleting their savings while they shifted funds to do things like improve their home environment. And now that we've returned to more of a normal setting, consumers have less money to spend, and now they're focusing those dollars on services and experience rather than things. Housing is also in a construction recession, despite the fact that we still have housing shortages, which indicates a long-term strong need. And additionally, factory output has been slowing as retailers really work to right-size those inventories that we've seen at peak levels over the past year or 2 years. So while these indicate signs of a slowing economy, a lot of that effect has already been felt in the freight economy. And now those models are showing that the freight market will actually turn around before the macroeconomy reacts. So if we look at the truck market specifically, capacity is still exiting the market, but not at the same pace that demand has dropped. That's really created that short-term mismatch of demand to supply. Some of the pieces that are impacting this is that large fleets are continuing to add tractors. However, smaller fleets that serve LTL and parcel markets are removing their tractors and their supply from their fleet. Additionally, many people invested in equipment in 2020 and 2021 at unprecedented prices from an equipment investment perspective. This has been really problematic as those fleets are potentially small or serving spot markets, and they're working to try to recoup those costs in a really softening freight market. Additionally, statistics are indicating that higher pay for drivers is actually not yielding the results that they thought they would. They thought that drivers would want to drive just as many hours and make more money, when in reality, drivers are prioritizing at-home time, which is resulting in them working less hours for the same amount of pay. So as you think about all of these different trends, the freight market has become and remains inverted for a record period of 12 months now. And inversion means that the spot rates nationally are lower than the contracted rate. This national average is about 41 cents per mile. And while this differs drastically region to region or here in California, new rates have also been typically seeing savings for most of the past year. So how should you react as a shipper? What we're recommending and what we're doing as a company at this time is working to stabilize our carrier base at a reasonable rate. Spot markets are expected to get back in line, and we'll talk to that more on the next slide. But this is really the time to find reliable carriers with good service levels at a market competitive rate. Most of the revised projections for 2023 show this correction will actually happen either at the end of Q3 or early into Q4, which makes this summer really the best time ahead of peak season to lock in new contracted rates. So now, what is the question that everyone really wants to know is, where will rates land? While I don't have a crystal ball to say exactly where that will be, industry experts are not expecting rates to fall to pre-pandemic levels due to the number of increased costs the industry saw, along with the general masses of industries that saw price increases from 2021 to 2023. Some of those costs, for example, are non-driver labor costs, maintenance costs, insurance premiums, just to name a few. These costs on average have totaled an 8% CAGR over the start of the pandemic through 2023. So if I were to look in my crystal ball and say, what will my rates look like? I would take my 2019 rates, apply that 8% CAGR, and that might be a good indication of where your rates are going to land in 2023. One area that's a little bit different is fuel. On the other hand, it is expected to continue to stabilize and potentially even continue to decline. The chart in the middle right of your screen shows highway diesel prices and the predictions for those from the EIA. And then along the same lines of truck, but slightly different, is the intermodal market. Intermodal has been more stable without the same volatile price increases or decreases. Right now, new rates in intermodal are averaging of a decrease of around 5% year over year. I also wanted to spend some time touching on regulation and how that may impact your business. AB5 is something that's been in the news, particularly here in California, quite frequently. It's an interesting topic and really relevant to California wine shippers in particular. For those who are not familiar with AB5, this is that ruling that requires California companies to treat owner-operators as employees. There has not been any significant updates in this ruling since August of 2022, but there is a recent federal proposal on the same topic, and it saw a ton of interest with over 54,000 public comments. There has not been an indication, however, on the ruling or timing of any ruling yet. California also remains one of 2 states that has not adopted the federal ELD mandate. CHP does have a proposal out there to adopt the federal mandate, but the general consensus is that we also won't see any action on this topic for at least a year. And then finally, for those who are thinking already ahead about their grape harvest, ag carriers are still receiving the hours of service exemption if those routes are coming from the ag source and they're traveling less than 150 air miles. I also wanted to touch on strikes. This has been something that's been in the news quite a bit over the past few years. And this is something that seems to come up on the West Coast in particular a lot. The West Coast ports are still in an ongoing labor discussion without a contract extension since mid-2022. So as a result, there's still growing uncertainty with these ports. And this has temporarily led to lower volumes and consequently higher service levels, as shippers have been diverting a lot of their imports to the East Coast ports for stability. The same is true for exports as well. This year was the first time we also saw significant rail strikes in the news since the early 90s. there were 14 labor unions actively engaged in negotiations with the Class 1 railroads, which is the largest classification of railroads. A strike was avoided with legal action utilizing the Railroad Labor Act in December of 2022, which helped us avoid the strike and implemented new contracts across all 14 unions. Railroads have now turned their eyes to really improving service, particularly as we've had a number of winter weather challenges. And then they're also really focused on the CP and KCS merger, which was recently approved by the STB and is really creating the first railroad that directly connects Canada with the US and Mexico. So with the volatile pricing that I just mentioned about truck rates and fuel over the past 3 years, many customers have been asking me if rail has become a better fit for their business. Rail has made several efforts to become more modern and become a better supply chain solution in recent years. Specific to wine and other beverages, shippers are now utilizing their own private cars, and these are actually insulated to protect against major temperature fluctuations. When we say insulated, I like to think about it like a house. If it's really hot inside and really cold outside, either one of those things is dampened by the fact that you're inside an insulated walls. It's very similar when you're in an insulated rail car. These rail cars also have cushioned underframes that support the smoothness of the car's ride along its rail journey. And they're outfitted with things now like door alarms, temperature alerts, and GPS that give more information about your product in transit. There also have been a number of dunnage improvements to reduce damage shipping on rail, and several of the railroads are now investing in API technologies that allow you to integrate and get that data about in-transit activity in real time and in your own systems. Finally, retailers and end customers are really driving shifts to more green practices within the industry. Rail shipping is on average 3 times more fuel efficient than truck, and is completely self-dependent on their investments, using about 15% of their revenue every year to make capital improvements to tracks to drive safer and more efficient shipping. So many people ask me how to know if rail is right for their company or why they would incorporate rail, especially now that I just told you truck prices are stabilizing. Rail can be an excellent option to diversify your supply chain. We at G3 saw a ton of success throughout the pandemic and post-pandemic years by having multimodal capabilities, allowing us to quickly and easily shift between modes, sometimes weekly or even daily based on supply and service. Consolidation is another avenue that has allowed more small and mid-sized companies to access rail. Intermodal, for example, only needs to be shipped in truckload quantities, and several 3PLs, including G3, now offer LTL consolidation at origin or deconsolidation at destination to better allow for freight to mix together from like origins to like destinations and still receive the savings that you see from carload rail shipping. Additionally, we're seeing this trend of more East Coast to West Coast rail shipping than in years past, because producers or receivers on the West Coast don't necessarily want to import into those West Coast ports, as I just mentioned, and instead they want to utilize the East Coast port. But they don't have a network or infrastructure to store or ship products from the East Coast because they're located on the West Coast. So they in turn are then looking to rail to load their products back to the West Coast and essentially have a moving warehouse or moving inventory avenue in order to do that. So those are a couple of the big trends that I'm seeing, John, in the industry. I'd like to open it up now to any questions that you may have.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you, Nicole. And you provided a very insightful presentation, and it has prompted some questions. Our first question is, what are the primary reasons wineries are turning to a rail-based supply chain?
Yeah, I think several different reasons are really impacting more wine on rail. The first of which is that green element that I mentioned, right? And so as retailers in particular have scorecards that measure your green initiatives as a supplier, we're often seeing that rail is one of the ways that suppliers can meet those needs by significantly reducing their carbon emissions 3 to 4 times by moving simply from truck to rail. The other big reason that we're seeing is that combination of service and stability that I mentioned. Because of the private insulated network of cars, 1,000 of which G3 has ourselves, we're actually the largest owner operator of those insulated cars on the rail network in North America. Because of those cars, we have the ability to really control the amount of supply that we have, or invest if we need to have more of that supply to meet different customer needs or shipping needs. And then that savings also comes through to the bottom line. As we all know, inflation has been really high in the US. Consumers are willing to spend a little bit more on their products, but they're hesitant to spend a lot more on their products. And so one of the ways that wineries in particular are keeping the cost of the end bottle down is by removing costs from the supply chain, particularly through their shipping. And rail is an affordable way to move your goods across the country for the bulk of your products.
And to follow up on your answer, if I'm a winery that's certified sustainable or looking to become sustainable, those environmental savings, that lowering of the carbon footprint, I can use those for my own business, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And G3 or any other railroad directly can provide you a carbon emission statement showing you the amount of savings.
Okay. All right. Our next question is, I worry about the quality of my wine once it reaches the destination. How can my winery know that my shipment is being handled with care and timeliness when it's on a rail car?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mentioned, that insulated car has really been revolutionary for wine on rail. We're shipping tens of thousands of rail cars worth of wine specifically each and every year with little to no incidents related to the temperature. And so like I mentioned, kind of that air conditioning versus just being in your insulated home, that's really a great analogy to help you understand the type of protection that your product has on rail. And it's a very safe way to move your products from origin to destination and can withstand even weeks worth of delays without having a significant temperature impact. From a damage perspective, less than 0.5% of our products actually see any damage on rail, and most of that's cosmetic.
Okay. And is there a way to monitor your shipment as it's going across the country to its destination?
Yeah, absolutely. The railroads have gotten way better at having that in-transit data that I mentioned. They've been upgrading their sensors, providing more real in-time transit data. Additionally, all of G3's rail cars have GPS on those units exactly, so we can see where they are at any given point. And then our customer portal actually allows customers to access that data themselves and not even have to reach out to a G3 representative to find out where their car is.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. We've got another question. Is there a certain formula to follow to determine if your winery is big enough to utilize a rail approach?
Yeah, I think the closest thing that I could give you to a formula, John, is really just if you can ship roughly 8 to 10 pallets going from an origin to destination, that tends to be enough volume to move on rail. We can consolidate that with other shippers that are going from the same general regions of the country to the same general destinations in the country. We can put that together in order to make rail shipments for customers. So they don't have to have 80 pallets, which is typically what you see in a full rail car, going to the same origin or same destination anymore.
Okay. And we've got a question on port and rail strikes. Do we anticipate any labor unrest this summer or this fall going into the year?
From a railroad perspective, we're not really anticipating any large strikes. There are still a number of very small agreements out there with some of the Canadian railroads that are relatively short and local disruptions that could potentially occur. Historically, we've never seen these last more than a handful of days. So from a Canadian railroad perspective, there is a little bit of risk, but nothing in the US. All of the major rail unions have now been included in that new legislation that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. From a port perspective, it's really hard to say what's going to happen on the West Coast port. I think the idea that the industry has really taken around diversifying and moving into multiple ports around the country is really helpful. G3 has actually seen our port drayage business grow a lot as a result of this, as customers look for additional ports where they maybe don't have those deep or long-standing relationships. And they're, looking for someone to solve that solution for them. Like I mentioned, you can also put products on rail to be able to get those consolidated to wherever you actually need your products to be in order to use various ports and reduce that risk.
Okay. Our next question is on the labor shortage. Do you envision the labor shortage impacting or threatening the logistics sector?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. I think the labor shortage is really pressing on all industries. I think as you think about trucking, there are a lot of statistics out there that show that the driver shortage is expected to increase. We're seeing that still in the tens of thousands, even with some of that reduction that I mentioned happened during the pandemic. We're still seeing that driver shortage continue to increase over the next 10 years. When you think about rail in particular, you really need about 2 operators to operate a single train worth of cargo, which is about 400 truckloads. With a truck, you need 1 driver per truck, right? And so you need about 400 truck drivers to move 400 truckloads. With rail, you need about 2, a conductor and an engineer, to move the same amount of freight. Of course, in both scenarios, you have other labor needs related to maintenance, et cetera. But that's one of the ways that a multimodal strategy can also help protect against some of the labor concerns, as we all seem to have those.
How is automation impacting the labor situation?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. So I think you see a lot in the news about automated trucking. So I'll actually focus on the warehousing side of this question. One of the ways that we are dealing with impacts to both the labor shortage as well as the labor pay increases is by looking at automation in our warehouses. And where we really see a lot of opportunity for not only the G3, but the industry as a whole is through automated put away systems. These have really grown in their capabilities and their stability over the past several years. And this is an avenue where companies can then look to reduce their overall workforce in those warehouses and increase quality and safety in those items as well in their warehouses by introducing automation in light or easy format.
We've got a follow-up question. What's the next big innovation coming from the supply chain?
Yeah, I think the next big innovation is really the evolution of that automated trucking, right? We've seen lots of Teslas on the road, especially here in California. But there's been a number of hurdles that have hit the trucking industry as they've looked to put that into the trucking market. My personal opinion is that's going to make a lot of sense for a lot of those daily routes, right? Not the long haul trucking. It's going to make sense more in the local markets where they're running regular routines, they're close to charging stations, those types of things. And so I think that's really what we'll see next from an evolution perspective, John.
Great. Another question. With so much news recently on rail accidents, is it safe to ship my wine via rail car?
Absolutely. The railroads, like I mentioned, spend a huge portion of their revenue every year in investing in their infrastructure. And the accidents that you do see on the news do tend to get a lot of press just because they are outside, they're easily accessible, they're typically large in scale. However, they tend to be few and far between. As you think about moving chemicals, for example, which is the hot topic with some of the more recent accidents, rail tends to actually be still the safest mode of transportation to move those types of products. And so it's very safe to move your food and beverage products as well.
That's great. Well, Nicole, I want to thank you for the fascinating insight. You gave us a lot to think about and a lot that's going on. What's the website address if we want to learn more about rail and our logistics strategies?
You can find us at g3enterprises.com.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. It was interesting to share my knowledge and see some of your questions today. There is information on the screen if you want to reach out to me directly as well, and I'm happy to answer any individual questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thanks.